When we look at the overall effect of fiscal policy, it's important to keep a few things in mind. First off, remember we said that if we're fighting against a contraction, then we use expansionary fiscal policy. Remember, it's counter-cyclical. So expansionary fiscal policy means a deficit budget, where government spending, G, is greater than the amount of government revenue, T. And the opposite should also be true, that if we're in an expansion and we're worried about inflation, then we use what's called a contractionary policy, which is a surplus budget. Well, unfortunately, what we'll find is that deficits for most governments around the world are the norm.
I just wanted to give some evidence that most countries run a deficit. So this is the CIA World Factbook. You see the year for most of these countries, it's going to be 2014, although some are a bit older. If it's a positive number, that means they're running a surplus. And if it's a negative number, it means it's a deficit. The size of the number refers to the percentage of GDP, so it's comparing the surplus to the GDP. We'll talk more about that later on. So we see Macau is doing 35.5%, quite a high number. And I'm just going to scroll down and through, and you notice, this number gets relatively small. We're down to 0. So basically, 36 of these countries run a surplus. That's obviously very few. A few of them, so looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, run a balanced budget. And you see of those 41 that don't have a deficit, with no insult, you don't see too many of the big economic heavy hitters there. Germany for sure, Russia, Switzerland. But a lot of the countries are rather small countries, and you can see that that would make it easier for you to have a balanced budget just because the numbers are so much smaller. But by no means is that across the board true, but it does tend to be, it's a tendency. From there on, we see that the rest of these countries, so call it 41, don't have a deficit, but the rest, and we're going to go all the way from 41 to 200 something. There's not really that many countries in the world. There are some countries included on here, like American Samoa, for example, that are technically not independent countries. But anyway, this goes all the way to 215. So, we're just showing that most countries in the world do in fact run a deficit. And it's interesting, people think, I've referenced it a few times, people think of the United States as having a massive budget deficit. Well, the number is quite large, but if you actually look, for example, compare it to the United Kingdom, the UK's deficit is equal to negative 4.8, call it 5% of their GDP, where we live here in South Africa, negative 4.4%. You actually see the US is quite a bit higher. So yes, they have a massive deficit, but they also have a massive GDP, so that kind of changes how important that is.
So since it's true that most governments do run a deficit from year to year, let's go ahead and look at the short and long-term effects of running a deficit. The short-term effects are typically what fiscal policy is aimed at, and they're all going to be demand-side effects. So we're going to see if the government spends more money, well, G goes up. That's easy. We said before that it's likely that there's going to be then more consumption. If more government spending means that there's more money in the circular flow, then eventually that's going to lead to more consumption, and eventually that's going to lead to more investment. So we would see G, C, and I go up. Well, what about exports? Would we see the amount of goods and services that we produce and are sending to other countries, would we see it go up? Well, that depends. Specifically, it depends on what's happening to the prices. If the deficit budget is causing inflation and prices of our products are going up, they're going to actually be less attractive to overseas consumers because there may or may not be inflation happening in their countries. So, if that's true that our prices are going up, well then actually exports would be going down. It's also likely that imports would be going up, which is to say, if prices in my country are becoming more expensive because of increases to aggregate demand, it's likely that I would buy cheaper goods from countries that aren't experiencing inflation. So those two added together are going to lessen the positive effects that these three have. Will they counteract them wholly? Well, probably not, but it's not going to be as much of an increase to aggregate demand as we think it might be. The long-term effects, remember when we talk about fiscal policy, we always talk about it being a demand-side policy, but there are effects on aggregate supply in the long term. If the government is always supporting aggregate demand, well, the business climate is likely to be healthy. Businesses are confident that the government is always supporting a demand, therefore, they're confident that they can produce more and somebody's going to buy it. So that's a good thing. It gives businesses the time, or the money, I should say, to conduct research and development. If they're not worried about pinching every penny because they're confident that money will come in, and money does come in because there's more aggregate demand over here, then it gives them the ability to look into research and development, finding better and cheaper ways to make better products. Well, again, that's a good thing. That's a positive effect on aggregate supply. It allows businesses to plan for the future. It allows them to be confident. I guess this goes back to the business climate, but it allows them to be confident that a year from now or 2 years from now, that they'll still be running a healthy business, that there'll still be steady demand for their products. So they can hire more people, they can plan to expand, and again, those are positive effects on aggregate supply. Another very common element of fiscal policy is what we call public works. We haven't actually discussed this yet, I don't think, but it's quite common for the government to say, okay, we need to just hire people. We talked about this at least once before, actually, when we talked about Roosevelt and the New Deal, and how Roosevelt, his idea was, we're just gonna hire people to do whatever it is, because we need people to not be unemployed, we need people to have money so that they'll consume. Well, typically what they're hired for, public works, are gonna be kind of big infrastructure projects in a country. So, if that's true, well, then down the line, the long-term effect is, there is more infrastructure in that country. So in the US, for example, the Hoover Dam is a major producer, produces a lot of electricity for the American Southwest, and that was produced as a public work during the Great Depression. Obviously, the point was to give those people money to spend, but it also has an effect on aggregate supply in the long term. Also, levels of human capital. When people don't have jobs, some of the first things that they don't do is they don't take care of their health, or maybe they don't pay to educate their kids or educate themselves because they simply don't have the money. So by reinforcing that, you improve the levels of human capital, health, and education for the long term. So those are both positives. If this is true, well then it's important to see that some of the arguments that a neoclassical might make against fiscal policy, some of those arguments don't hold as much water. In the Keynesian view, aggregate demand shifts from 81 to 82 because of government policies, and this might be met by this higher price, and that might be seen as a negative. But if in the long term we're supporting aggregate supply, we see that aggregate supply is going to shift out as well, and price level is going to remain the same in the long term. It might go up in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to go back down to PL1 and even further increases to income at full employment. So we see national income continually being pushed to the right, not only by the aggregate demand changes, but also because of the changes to aggregate supply. This holds true in the neoclassical model. So neoclassical might say, well, that's not what aggregate supply actually looks like. Well, you can see the same logic actually would apply in the neoclassical model as well. Yes, there's going to be more aggregate demand, and that could lead to higher prices all the way up here. But if we're seeing these improvements to aggregate supply, well then eventually what's going to happen is long run and short run aggregate supply are also going to move to the right, again leaving us at the same price level that we were before. So we get the increase to national income, but we don't have that negative effect of inflation. Now obviously this is something that not everyone agrees upon, but it is important to consider that it might, it might change the discussion somewhat. Of course, the neoclassical response to this would say, okay, well fine, it's going to have some effect on aggregate supply, but wouldn't the effects on aggregate supply be greater if we left it to the market? if we kept the government out of it. Okay, then I want to just go through some general arguments for and against, or just some general evaluation of fiscal policy. So this will be kind of quick. For the most part, I tried to make a negative for every positive and a positive for every negative, but that wasn't always possible. One big argument for fiscal policy was, look, the Great Depression happened. Classical economics didn't solve what happened in the Great Depression, so somebody needed to act. This is Keynes' famous quote of, in the long run, we're all dead. Maybe it's not optimal, but I don't want to wait for the economy to regulate itself over the next 20 years. That's too much of my life. Of course, the counter argument to that would be, yeah, but when the economy is doing well, you should run a surplus, but nobody ever does. So it just makes government spending and the role of the government in the economy larger and larger and larger. Also, if we're running a surplus, so this is a furthermore, if we're running a surplus, what that means is I'm giving the government, say, $100 of tax, and they're only spending $70 back on me. Well, wait a minute, why am I paying that tax then? If I were to go into a store and give them $50 of my dollars, I would expect to get back $50 worth of their product. If they only gave me $35 back, and no change, that wouldn't be okay. So people ask the same thing. I pay taxes because the government provides me services. What if they don't provide me services? Well, then I shouldn't have to pay those taxes. An argument in favor of fiscal policy is that fiscal policy can be targeted. Specifically, we can make sure to pay for, we can focus the government spending programs on merit and public goods. And remember, that's part of market failure. That's in microeconomics, we said the market fails to provide each of those things. Well, the government can choose to provide those things, so that might be good. However, always there's the inefficiency argument of, well, but is it going to cost too much? Is it going to cost more than if the private market did it itself? That's always something to keep in mind. But then there's always the possibility that when the government is taking its money and maybe paying a company to build hospitals, maybe paying a company to build schools or roads or bridges, whatever it might be, whatever these merit or public goods might be, there's always that argument of, well, maybe the government's going to spend or give that money to their friends. Maybe they're not going to find the best price. They're just going to give it to a buddy of theirs who runs that company, somebody who contributed to their campaign or something like that. Another argument in favor of fiscal policy is that the government can be relatively sure that the impact is going to happen the way they want. If they try to make aggregate demand shift in a different way, it may or may not happen. But if the government just directly injects G into the circular flow has to grow. The neoclassical response would be, yeah, but it's likely to grow too much, and we're just going to end up with higher rates of inflation. An argument against fiscal policy is that fiscal policy takes a long time to enact. You have to figure out, first of all, what the economy is doing. It might seem like we're in a recession or a contraction, but until the numbers come back, it's hard to definitively say that we are and then act on it. So it takes time to figure out where we're at in the business cycle. It takes time then to pass a budget, and then it takes time for the budget to actually have an effect. Roll into that the whole problem that in most countries, in fact, I don't know of an exception, so every country, the budget is only set yearly, and it's set well in advance. So they might set it 2 to 3 or 4 months prior to it being enacted. So that means, over the next year and a half or so, well, the economy could do anything, and now you might have the wrong type of budget in place. The response to that from a Keynesian would be, yeah, but don't forget about the automatic stabilizers. Those are going to keep it from going too bad one way or the other. I've made this argument against fiscal policy a few times already, but just keep in mind the people who set fiscal policy, for the most part, they're legislators, and for the most part, in democratic societies, they get their jobs by keeping people happy. They get their jobs by getting votes. Well, raising taxes is unpopular and cutting spending is unpopular. which means, and that's what we saw in the earlier data, what that means is that for the most part, they never run surpluses and always run deficits. Another issue that we need to keep in mind, this is a new issue, so you can't keep it in mind yet. This is the issue that we call crowding out. I'm going to explain it over here. Remember we talked about that when the government runs a deficit, that they end up having to borrow money from somebody else. Banks in their country, citizens of their country, banks and citizens of foreign countries. We're only going to look at the domestic ones, so we're talking about domestic banks for the most part. If a bank, so say FNB, if they buy up government bonds, so if the bank starts to lend money to the South African government, what that means is that there's less of a supply of money to be lent. This is the market for loanable funds. Note that it's micro, and the price is the interest rate. Well, what this means is there's less of a supply of money to be lent to individual consumers and to businesses. So, therefore, the interest rate is going to climb, and the amount of investment and consumption from borrowing is also going to decline. So let's go backwards a bit. If the government's running a deficit, it means that they're worried about a recession or a contraction. So what they want is consumption and investment to increase. So they deficit spend, which means that they have to borrow money, which means that investment and consumption due to borrowing is going to decrease, not increase. That problem is what is referred to as crowding out. So basically government borrowing has crowded out or taken up all the room, and there's not room for private borrowing. There is also the opportunity cost. There'll still be some private borrowing, but the cost of that borrowing is going to be high, and they can't then use that money on some of those other things that we talked about, research and development, hiring other workers, things like that. The overall effect of that is that the increase of the aggregate demand due to government spending, the government thinks it's going to increase all the way over to aggregate demand intended, maybe due to the Keynesian multiplier, whatever. But because I and C are going to decline, that increase to G is going to be somewhat limited by the decreases to especially I. So they thought they were going to get this big shift of aggregate demand, but instead they get a smaller shift, or maybe in an extreme case, no shift at all. That's referred to as complete crowding out. I'm showing what's called partial crowding out. Anyway, the shift to aggregate demand is not going to be what they hoped it would be. The response to that would be, well, yeah, but don't forget, when the government is constantly supporting aggregate demand, businesses feel confident, like we previously talked about. So, if businesses feel confident, in fact, there's going to be more I, not less I. And that, again, that goes back to kind of our concept of the Keynesian multiplier, that increase is going to cycle through, and it's going to be even more than what was intended. The final problem we need to consider is that when there's a change to T, it's not going to directly equal a change to C. So if the government chooses, for example, to lower income tax brackets, even the automatic stabilizer of people making less money and falling down income tax brackets, but oftentimes there's a fiscal policy of saying, okay, well, we're not going to spend more money, we're just going to tax you less to boost consumption. The problem is, if I pay $100 less of tax, I'm not then going to turn around and spend $100 more on consumption. Remember, the marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save and pay buy imports dictates that some of that money is going to go to savings and imports instead of staying in the circular flow. If you have any questions, post a comment down below and I'll respond.